Lesson two, you're going to see the civil rights movement gain some ground today. So I'm going to talk about some other pretty important figures and name drop a few people, and you're probably going to recognize. So again, make sure you're listening for those individuals and groups that are making a big difference in the civil rights and liberties of African Americans. And also, as always, make sure you pay attention for the causes and effects of American history. So again, you're going to be hearing groups of people, you're going to hear individuals. I may not directly call them groups and I may not directly call them individuals, but when in doubt, you can always Google it or you can ask a teacher. So where we last talked about were a group of people called the Little Rock Nine and how they were interacting with white students in a white school. We also talked about Rosa Parks being the individual that are making a change. And we also talked about Brown versus the Board of Education. You talk about Congress, but there's just a lot of things happening in that first lesson. But you're going to notice that African Americans, are going to start wanting more, and they're going to start doing more protests. So where you're going to see this is now going to spill over is in the college campuses. I mean, they are going to be huge here during this time, and specifically in Greensboro, North Carolina. So in 1960, there's going to be 4 African American college students that are going to sit down at a lunch counter where it's illegal for African Americans to be sitting, and they are going to protest basically this law of not being able to be served. So they're going to sit there, and they're going to sit there, and then more people are going to start coming in and more people are going to start sitting with them, and eventually sit-ins are going to basically happen all around the United States during the time. Very popular non-violent way of protesting during the time. And you're going to notice they're not just protesting lunch counters, they're protesting beaches. I have libraries written there, and you're going to notice that this is a very effective way because you're visually seeing the drawbacks of basically not serving African Americans, and basically the numbers are going to start standing out left and right. So here's my first question for you. A popular nonviolent protest strategy of the time was called, and why was this all nonviolent? And it's because the man himself, Martin Luther King, is preaching nonviolence. So if you think about who he was, it only makes sense nonviolent. He was a preacher. He had a doctorate in theology, which basically means religions. So he is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So notice how he is going to give important speeches and how he drops in, basically Christianity left and right. So he had his hand in the Montgomery bus boycott. As you can see here, he was arrested multiple times for trying to fight these Jim Crow laws. But you're going to notice that people are just hated him because he inspired, which is a big deal. So he's actually going to help organize what's arguably the biggest nonviolent protest of the time, and it's the March on Birmingham. And you're going to notice that this is where it's going to get very ugly and very public. So in 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, which is basically the most segregated, separated country or city in the country, and not only are adults going to protest, but also kids are going to protest. So where this is all going to hit the fan is that all of this is caught on camera, and not only picture camera, but also news camera. So when all of this happens, you're going to notice there's going to be multiple arrests. There's going to basically be mistreatment. You can see dogs attacking kids in the fire hose in the bottom. I mean, that would just hurt. And people are being hit so hard with that fire hose that it's actually tearing hair off of their head. So when Martin Luther King Jr. is in jail, he basically wrote one of the most iconic speeches called Wait. And he wrote it on toilet paper. He wrote it on the margins of a newspaper. And he basically relayed the message of, we're sick and tired of waiting. And now we're going to start making our voices heard. Again, non-violently. But all this time, even in those different police attacks and so on and so forth, the African Americans never fought back. So who is going to see all this happening on the news? Arguably the most important person that could, the president, JFK. So when he sees all of this protest and the kids being hurt on live TV, where he did not want to address civil rights until his second term, It's a presidency thing. Just trust me. He is now going to make this his first term push. He is going to back what's known as the Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, he doesn't get a chance to sign it into effect because he gets assassinated. But why this matters is that he is now taking a stand against civil rights, or I guess a stand against mistreatment of African Americans as the president of the United States, forcing a real change to now kind of happen. So here's my question for you. Which city was the focal point of the nonviolent march slash protest during the time? So enter in probably Martin Luther King's biggest spotlight, I guess you would say, is that shortly before all the civil rights stuff was going to be set to pass, you're going to notice that Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize what's now known as his I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington. So I've heard everything from 200,000 to 250,000. Number doesn't really matter. Just a lot of people showed up. And you notice it right around the Lincoln Monument or the Washington Monument. So if you actually go there, you can actually step on the footprints of where he was standing. And this is where he gives his I Have a Dream speech. And he gave it outside the Lincoln Monument. And this is a big deal because obviously Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. So he is going to kind of tailor and work that into his speech. And if you ever get a chance to listen to it, I highly recommend it. And what's funny is that he wasn't even going to mention his dream. Somebody in the back said, "Hey, Martin, tell him about your dream." And that's when he went off. So if you notice, when he does give that part of the speech, he never looks down because it's all off the top of his head, which is very, very impressive in my opinion. So shortly thereafter, you're going to notice that four little girls are actually going to be assassinated. And this is really kind of sad, but that's going to push back the vote. And then JFK is going to be assassinated. That's going to push back the vote. But it was shortly thereafter that JFK's vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, is going to finally make it happen. So in 1964, LBJ, who's from Texas, which is worth noting, which is a big deal because he's a Southerner, is going to sign into effect the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which completely makes all Jim Crow laws 100% illegal, no loopholes. And was the legislation that was needed to make African Americans truly equal, so they thought at the time. So here's my question for you. Signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 eliminated which of the following?